Hello and welcome to your pre-lab lecture on the urinary system.
The first thing we need to discuss is where these kidneys lie. You will have the right kidney sit just a bit lower than the left kidney, but they will be surrounded with the same supportive tissues. Your first layer you will run into, if you are dissecting this area, it's already dissected for you most likely, is the renal fascia. So this is going to be this area that kind of surrounds, I would say, more of the retroperitoneal area. We have an anterior and posterior aspect, and they come together laterally. Now, just deep to that, we will have the perirenal fat capsule, and this is typically quite a bit of fat. It's really rare that we don't have a lot of fat surrounding the kidneys because they really help to cushion and support and protect the kidneys. Right on the actual kidney itself, we will have the fibrous capsule. And so this is the capsule that you will be identifying in lab because it's probably the only one left on the kidney. This is just a cadaveric image for you to see this. This kidney has been cut in the frontal plane. We see the capsule adhered to the kidney tissue right in this area over here. Next, we're going to discuss the renal hilum, or you can also call this the renal hilus. This is just the medial aspect of our kidney where we see structures entering and exiting. In this case, we would have your renal veins exiting, your renal arteries entering, and your ureters exiting, heading on down to the urinary bladder. If we were to cut the kidney in a frontal plane, you would start to see that it has almost different layers. The one that is most on the periphery of the kidney is your renal cortex. Now, the area that's highlighted in green is all cortical tissue, meaning it's all tissue that we find within the cortex. But technically, the renal cortex is just this peripheral region that I've highlighted in purple. If we look internal to that cortex, we would have your renal medulla. So that is both the renal columns that you saw highlighted in the previous slide that is made up of cortical tissue, and it includes what is new to us, these medullary pyramids. And so the tissue, the renal columns, would be the cortical tissue that sits between these medullary pyramids right in here. So all of this would be your medulla in this region. At the very tip of your medullary pyramids, you will have the renal papilla, which is highlighted in green for you here. These renal papilla will have the very end of the collecting duct, which we will get into in the lecture portion of our urinary system. It'll have the very end of the collecting duct, which is collecting all of your filtrate that basically is becoming the urine that we will be excreting from our body. So from this tip here, that urine will move into an area that we will learn next called the minor calyces. But before we get into that, all of this area beyond the cortex, beyond the medulla, is called the renal sinus. So it's just a space where we will find some structures that I will identify in the next slides. So here are minor calyces. These are one of the structures that belong inside our renal sinus. And you can see the very tip of the renal papilla here would drain into these minor calyces. So here's a renal papilla draining into this minor calyce. Same thing here. Papilla into the minor calyce. And if we wanted to say minor calyce in a singular form, we would call that the minor calyx. So this is a minor calyx. all of these minor calyces are then going to drain into major calyces. So they're just larger tubes, and they are going to congregate together to move that urine into what's known as the renal pelvis, which is more of this funnel-shaped structure, and distal to that will be the ureter. So at this point, we can see the ureter exiting, and it'll continue on down. It's about 25 centimeters long, and it'll enter the urinary bladder. So before we discuss the urinary bladder, I want to talk about some vasculature of our kidney. We've already discussed the renal artery and vein, but let's just review it to make sure we're all on the same page. So coming from the aorta, the abdominal aorta, we are going to give blood supply to the kidney. This will bring in oxygenated blood into the kidney for it to be filtered, and we'll discuss the full details of how blood travels in the lecture portion of the urinary system. So from our renal artery, we will go through more arteries into our arterioles. We actually have 2 capillary beds we'll move through in a more microscopic portion of the kidney, and then the venules will lead to veins, and specifically what we see here is your left renal vein, and that will drain into your inferior vena cava, which we know will take that blood back to the heart. So here's a bit more detail as to how that blood is going to flow. Again, the renal artery comes off of the abdominal aorta. It will split into segmental arteries. I forgot I had this highlighted. So we have our segmental arteries, which, by the way, we do not have segmental veins that will correspond with these. From these segmental veins, we will move into our interlobar arteries, and that will then turn into arcuate arteries, which, if we're lucky, we'll see these in lab, but most likely we will not. Those arcuate arteries will then turn into cortical, there's my mouse, cortical radiate arteries that will be in the region of the cortex. At this point, it will then branch into a afferent arteriole that will give blood over into our glomerulus, and at this point, filtration is going to start taking place. The blood will then exit, or I shouldn't say exit, it'll move through the efferent arteriole into a capillary system. And the capillary system that can exist are your peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta, and we'll talk about the difference in class. From there, we are then going to lead the blood into venules that will carry it to our cortical radiate vein. That'll come back to an arcuate vein, which will lead into a interlobar vein. Remember, we're skipping segmental veins because they don't exist, and instead those interlobar veins will go straight into the renal vein to drain into inferior vena cava that will travel back to the heart. Here is a cadaver view of what these arteries look like. Here's your renal artery leading in. That will then give branch to segmental arteries, which will branch into interlobar arteries. And then if we're lucky, we will find some arcuate arteries that will arc around the medullary pyramid and then give branches to cortical radiate arteries. Leaving the kidney, we will have urine that will go into the renal pelvis. We will find this right in the area of the hilum, and that leads into your ureter, which will bring that urine down to your urinary bladder. So let's pick up over there. Here's your ureter once again that you will find in the posterior abdominal cavity. Notice how it is traveling over this big muscle here known as your psoas major. Once it gets to your urinary bladder, you will have orifices in which the urine will move from the ureter into the urinary bladder. Now this area, if we draw a line from each of the ureter ureteric orifices and lines down to your internal urethral sphincter, it forms a triangle. And this triangle is known as your trigone. It's kind of the pathway that urine will take in order to empty out the body. In your urinary bladder, we also will have this muscle called the detrusor muscle. I love that name. It sounds like a superhero. Detrusor is here to save the day. Anyway, so this detrusor muscle, when it contracts, it will cause the bladder to empty. And the internal urethral sphincter we already discussed. We will find that right in this area where the neck of the bladder is found and the very inferior point of our trigone. So here's a cadaveric image of a bladder that has been cut open. You could see the urethral openings here, or the ureteric orifices. So if we draw a line across here and also down over to our internal urethral sphincter, which isn't really shown in this picture because it is covered with tissue, but we would find it in the areas where I have the blue arrows. So if we were to draw a line down from those ureter openings, we would have our triangle here. That would be our trigone. And our detrusor muscle, once again, will be found all around the bladder in this region. And since we have this cadaveric image of a female up, again, this is a mid-sagittal cut. Just to orientate you, this is our urinary bladder. Inferior to this, we have the ureter, following it here. Anterior to this is your pubic symphysis, so this is our pubic bone over here. And notice how your bladder sits superior to this pubic symphysis. Posterior to your urinary bladder, we have the uterus, and inferior to your uterus is the vagina. So this would be the vaginal orifice over here. This would be the external urethral orifice. And then posterior to the vagina, we have the rectum, and then inferiorly, the anus. So I wanted to illustrate for you further the external urethral sphincter and the internal urethral sphincter. When we look at the bladder, right where we see the neck of the bladder, we will have the internal urethral orifice, and the internal urethral sphincter will be found external to that orifice. And this is made up of smooth muscle, so it is involuntary control for us. If we go further down the urethra, right at the area of the pubis, we have the external urethral sphincter. And this is made up of skeletal muscle, so it is under voluntary control. And the urethra is going to be much longer within a male. So you can see within a female, if we go back to this cadaver picture, it's quite short, whereas if we look at it in a male, we have quite the long path in order for that urine to leave via the external urethral orifice. So let's look at our bladder here, and then at this point is where we would have our internal urethral sphincter. The prostate surrounds the urethra here, so when you hear that somebody has an enlarged prostate, they typically have issues urinating because it impinges upon this area of the urethra, and this is called your prostatic part of the urethra. Do not worry about the pre-prostatic part of the urethra just yet. We will talk about that next quarter when we discuss the reproductive system. Beyond the point of the prostate, we have your membranous urethra, and within this area, or surrounding this area, we will find the external urethral sphincter. Beyond that membranous urethra, we will have the urethra sit within what's known as the corpus spongiosum of the penis, and so this is called, rightfully so, the spongy urethra, or it's also known as the penile urethra. So here is a cadaveric view of this urethra. You can see the bladder is highlighted in green. And so just below that area, we will see the prostatic urethra. The prostate is more of this white region in here. And so the urethra that lies within it is called the prostatic urethra. Beyond that, we have the membranous urethra, which is quite short. And once we start to see that corpus spongiosum tissue, we will know that that is our penile or spongy urethra.